Hi Internet, I'm Ariel, food scientist and plant breeder by training. So I just finished up 7 long years of grad school and wanted to take some time off to do something I really enjoy, experimenting in the kitchen. So I'm using this series, Hybrid Bakes, to document the trial and error process I take to develop hybrid desserts. I've compiled a list of American and French desserts. Each week, I'm letting my computer randomly select 2 desserts for me to combine. Okay, so let's see what the computer has me making this week. So the computer has spoken, and this week I'll be making hybrid between pecan or pecan pie and Marjolaine. Marjolaine? Hold on, let me look this up.
Marjolaine.
Marjolaine.
Okay, so let's try this again. The computer has spoken, and this week I will be making a hybrid between pecan pie and Marjolaine. I was born and raised in Georgia, so I know what pecan pie is. In its most basic form, pecan pie is single-crusted. It's filled with pecans and a brown sugar molasses custard. I quickly whipped one up to test a pecan pie filling recipe developed by Rick Martinez from Bon Appetit and a pie dough recipe developed by Stella Parks from Serious Eats. I also tested Stella's blind baking method, which uses aluminum foil as a liner, granulated sugar to weigh the liner down, and blind baking low and slow at 350 Fahrenheit for 75 minutes. And the pie looked great when I took it out of the oven. I did run into some issues when cutting the pie. Some filling had leaked through the crust, making pie retrieval a little difficult, but I eventually got there.
Yes!
And the pie was delicious. The crust was buttery, flaky, and tender. The filling was ooey, gooey, and deep in flavor, and also importantly, not too sweet. Most of the pecans had floated to the top, which provided a really great crunch, almost as if the pecans were candied. My only criticism of the filling was the size of the pecans. The recipe used whole pecan halves, making it a little difficult to cut, and the ratio of pecan and gooey filling in each bite inconsistent. So here are the defining characteristics of pecan pie. It has a buttery, flaky crust, candied-like pecans, an ooey gooey texture, and a deep molassesy brown sugar flavor. Now moving on to the more challenging dessert, the Marjolaine. After doing some research, I found out that Marjolaine is a gluten-free dessert made with layers of nutty meringue sandwiched between layers of pastry cream. All of this is enrobed in chocolate ganache and decorated with nuts. I've never tasted a Marjolaine, yet alone made one before, so who better to guide me through my first Marjolaine experience than Mary Berry? I decided to test her Marjolaine recipe, which was actually given as a technical challenge on the Great British Bake Off, where, like me, the bakers had no clue what a Marjolaine was. Luckily, however, I had more than 3 hours to make this, and I'm not being judged by Paul. So there are 4 main components to this Marjolaine: a daiquoise, which is a glorified meringue with nuts, a chocolate ganache, a French buttercream, and French praline that's blitzed up and folded into the buttercream. I'm guessing fewer people have experience with Marjolaines compared to pecan pie, so I'm walking through this bake a little more thoroughly. So I set out on this arduous process, making the daiquoise, which involved blanching, deskinning, blitzing, and toasting almonds, toasting, deskinning, and blitzing hazelnuts, whipping egg whites into stiff glossy meringue, folding the toasted nuts into the meringue, spreading the mixture onto 2 parchment-lined quarter baking sheets, then baking the daiquoise at 300 Fahrenheit until golden and dry to touch. When it had completely cooled, I cut each daiquoise in half lengthwise. I then moved on to the simple task of making the chocolate ganache, which involved pouring warmed heavy cream over semi-sweet chocolate chips and mixing until homogeneous. I then moved on to the not-so-simple task of making the French buttercream. I heated sugar, water, and cream of tartar to 239 Fahrenheit, then slowly streamed this hot mixture into a bowl of whisked egg yolks while whisking. I wasn't a huge fan of this method because, as you can see, the sugar syrup stuck to the sides of the bowl, making it a pain to deal with. When the mixture was thick and cool, I gradually added in butter 1 tablespoon at a time and whisked until the buttercream was soft and smooth. Finally, I made the French praline, which involved heating water and sugar until golden brown, adding in toasted almonds, and pouring it out onto a parchment-lined baking sheet. Once it cooled, I blitzed it into a fine powder and folded it into the French buttercream. Once I had all the components made, I began assembling the Marjolaine, starting with 1 layer of daiquoise, then 1 layer of buttercream, another layer of daiquoise, followed by a layer of chocolate ganache, making sure that everything was even, then a layer of daiquoise, then buttercream, followed by 1 final layer of daiquoise, so a total of 7 layers. After assembling this rectangular beast, I then covered all visible sides with buttercream, the sides with almonds, and decorated the top with piped chocolate ganache and hazelnuts. Eating the Marjolaine is very much a textural experience. The daiquoise is crisp, the Marjolaine is light and airy despite having 7 hefty layers, it's crunchy from the assortment of toasted nuts, and it's creamy from the French buttercream. In terms of taste, it's very nutty and very, very sweet, almost sickly sweet, so I'll be sure to dial down the sugar in the hybrid. The ganache has a strong, rich chocolate flavor, but to be honest, it doesn't really meld with the other flavors, possibly because everything else is just so gosh darn sweet. So here are the defining characteristics of this Marjolaine. It's multi-layered, it's texturally complex, with crispness and airiness from the daiquoise, smoothness from the French buttercream, and crunch from the toasted nuts. There's a very deep chocolatey flavor from the ganache, it's nutty, and it's very sweet. So the main thing to keep in mind is that the hybrid should ideally draw equally from the two desserts, in terms of taste, texture, appearance, and in the preparation and cooking method used. So here are my ideas for the hybrid. It's going to have 6 different types of layers. Like the Marjolaine, it'll have layers of praline French buttercream, nutty daiquoise, and chocolate ganache. And like pecan pie, it'll have layers of pecan pie filling and crust. I'll use these layers to build a 9-layer hybrid and encase the entire dessert in a buttery, flaky crust. To make the pie shell that's going to encase the entire dessert, I once again made a batch of Stella Parks pie dough, this time forming the dough into a 5 by 2.5 inch springform pan and chilling it in the fridge for 24 hours before blind baking. To make the layer of crust that's going to be sandwiched in the dessert, I cut out 2 4.5 inch diameter circles from the remaining dough and stored it in the fridge for 24 hours before blind baking. I only needed 1 disc of crust for the hybrid, but made 2 just in case. To blind bake the shell, I used the same method as before, lining the crust with aluminum foil and weighing it down with sugar. I tested 2 methods to blind bake the discs. For 1 disc, I weighed it down with a baking sheet, but because the edges of the disc aren't contained in any way, I wasn't sure if the dough would flatten and widen under the weight of the pan. So as a preemptive test, I blind baked the other disc with nothing on it. After 26 minutes of baking, I pulled the discs out and saw that the sheet pan method worked perfectly fine. The disc maintained its 4.5 inch diameter. After 75 minutes of baking, I pulled out the pie shell. Once cooled, I trimmed off the excess crust hanging from the edge of the springform pan and carefully removed the shell from the pie. For the pecan pie filling layers, I used Bon Appetit's pie filling recipe, but chopped the pecans into more manageable pieces. My initial idea was to transfer the cooked filling to a piping bag, then piping the layers of filling onto the hybrid. But after thinking about it, I realized that the filling may be too viscous to pipe, and I also wanted the top layer of the hybrid to look as much like a pecan pie as possible, with candied pecans suspended on the surface of the pie filling. Also thinking about it now, having a top layer of extruded pie filling would look pretty unappetizing. So I changed course and baked the pie filling in a 9-inch pie pan rather than a ramekin. I needed 2 layers of filling for the hybrid, so once the filling had completely cooked and chilled in the fridge, I cut out a 4.5-inch circle, then excavated the remaining filling, reserving those pieces to hand mold into another 4.5-inch circle. In future iterations of this dessert, I'm going to bake the filling in a quarter sheet pan so that I have enough surface area to cut out 2 circles, because as you'll see later, forming that second layer of filling was a messy pain. I then moved on to making the daiquoise, cutting the sugar by 17%, adding in a pinch of salt, and folding in toasted pecans rather than almonds and hazelnuts into the meringue. I traced 2 4.14-inch discs on parchment paper, flipped the paper over, and piped approximately 21 grams of daiquoise into each circle. I then baked the daiquoise at 300 Fahrenheit for 35 minutes until lightly golden and firm to touch, then let it cool completely. I used the same recipe as before for the chocolate ganache because I think the rich chocolate flavor will pair well with the pecan pie filling, and I didn't want to use a darker chocolate because I didn't want to move into the dark bitter territory. Next, I made the Praline French Buttercream. For the buttercream, I decided to use a method that avoids pouring boiling sugar syrup into a running mixer. So I first combined egg yolks, sugar, bourbon, vanilla, and salt in the bowl of a stand mixer, placed it over a double boiler, and brought the mixture up to 155 Fahrenheit, stirring and scraping constantly. When the mixture came to temperature, I transferred the bowl to a stand mixer and whipped on high until it became fluffy and stiff. With the mixer still running, I added in the butter 1 tablespoon at a time and mixed until the buttercream was thick and creamy. For the praline component of the buttercream, I tested 2 types of praline, an American pecan praline and a French praline. French pralines are a firm combination of nuts, traditionally almonds, and caramelized sugar, whereas American pralines are softer, creamier, and fudgier because in addition to nuts and sugar, you also add milk, cream, or butter to the mixture. American pecan praline is really reminiscent of pecan pie, using many of the same ingredients and also originating from the South, so I thought it'd be fun to test out a batch. I made both pralines, made a sample batch of each buttercream, and test-tasted both. The buttercream with the American praline tasted good, but ultimately I preferred the French praline buttercream because it had a cleaner, brighter, and more pecan-y flavor, whereas the American Praline buttercream was very dairy heavy because of the addition of cream and butter. After this taste test, I whipped the French Buttercream and French Praline together using a 2-to-1 ratio of buttercream to praline and transferred the mixture into a piping bag. Okay, so to recap, for this hybrid, I made the following items: 1 pie shell, 1 crust disc, 2 pecan pie filling discs, 2 Dacquoise discs, praline French buttercream, and chocolate ganache. To construct the hybrid, I first piped a layer of buttercream into the pie shell. I then applied a thin layer of chocolate ganache to one side of a Dacquoise disc. Then placed the disc inside the pie shell with the ganache side facing up. I then molded the pecan pie filling into a disc-like shape using grease gloves and carefully transferred this filling layer on top of the ganache. Again, I applied a thin layer of ganache to one side of a Dacquoise disc, this time placing the disc in the shell with the ganache side facing down. Next, I piped in a layer of buttercream, then placed the pie crust on top. Finally, I transferred the pie filling disc onto the pie crust. I cut the disc into 4 quadrants to make it easier to transfer. After 3 days of work, I finally introduce you to the Pecan Marjolaine pie. Like the Marjolaine, it's multi-layered and texturally complex, but also has the added ooey gooey goodness of the pecan pie filling and a buttery flaky crust. The chocolate ganache is a lot more balanced with the addition of the pecan pie filling, and the silky smooth texture and rich custard flavor of the buttercream pairs really well with the pie filling, almost in the same way as how vanilla ice cream pairs with pecan pie. Overall, I'm pretty happy with how this hybrid turned out, but there are a few things that could be improved. The layers of Dacquoise needed to be thicker. I was aiming for 7mm, but only got mine up to 5mm. The pecan pie filling needed to be thinner. Again, I was aiming for 7mm, but overshot and had layers measuring 15mm. It was also a little difficult to cut the Pecan Marjolaine pie. You need to have a sharp knife and some patience. I found it a lot easier to cut when it had been refrigerated for a few hours. I had a lot of fun making this Pecan Marjolaine pie, and if you think you'd like to give it a go, you can find the full recipe by following the link in the description. And if you enjoyed this video or learned something new, please consider subscribing. Let me know in the comment section what you would have done to hybridize these 2 desserts, and if you have any ideas on improving this recipe. Thanks for watching, guys, and I'll see you next time.